The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 23. Invitation and Infiltration. Summer 1995. The Grangers were indeed coming to Malfoy Manor that summer, but not for betrothal contract negotiations, much to Draco's immense relief and simultaneous slight and unreasonable disappointment. There was to be a reception to welcome back old friends and family, Narcissa told him in clipped tones when she met him at the platform in King's Cross. "Where's father?" Draco asked stiffly. He had a feeling that this reception was not going to be a joyous occasion. "Convalescing," she answered, equally taciturn. "From?" he asked sharply. "We'll discuss it at home," she replied with a meaningful look at him. She turned and came face to face with Linda and Hermione. "Ah, Linda! Hermione! So good to see you both," his mother said, and she looked to be telling the truth. In fact, she almost looked relieved that the two of them had approached at all. "Narcissa?" Hermione's mother said, tilting her head in curiosity, as though trying to puzzle out something. "It's good to see you too. It's been a little while since I've heard from you." "Yes, well, it's been a bit busy as of late. I've had family obligations." Replied Linda, furrowing her brow. "I understand. I've been dealing with family issues myself." Hermione looked up sharply at her mother. Draco took a chance and spoke up. "Miss Granger, is your husband with you? I hope he's not feeling ill." His stomach was in knots. As long as Draco had known Lucius, he'd never been sick a day in his life. Even when Draco had been 7, and Lucius had fallen off his broomstick from 30 feet in the air, demonstrating the Pemberton turn, he'd taken only an hour or so to recover, at least well enough to talk. If his own father was convalescing, Draco was highly concerned about how Hermione's Muggle father had handled any punishment doled out by the Dark Lord. "Richard had to work. Emergency dental situation. Couldn't be helped, I'm afraid. But we'll all see each other next week, I'm sure." "Next week?" asked Draco. "For the reception, of course. We wouldn't miss it." Hermione's eyes flew wide, accompanied by Narcissa's and Draco's. "Oh," Narcissa faltered, "you're invited? I wasn't aware. We're only offering our home as the location for this reception. Another wizard is hosting it, I'm afraid." And now that Draco looked more properly at his mother, she did look quite afraid. Did Narcissa not realize that bringing Richard into this nonsense also meant bringing in Linda? Draco wondered. "Did you not want us to come?" Linda asked, looking a bit hurt. "Of course, I want you all to come. Yes, I'm always happy to spend time with you, Linda," Narcissa said earnestly. Linda smiled, but looked at Narcissa a bit sadly. Draco had a feeling that Linda was in the dark about her husband's clandestine activities, but perhaps she had an inkling that something was afoot. "Lovely. We're looking forward to it," Hermione's mother said. "We should get going. Draco, Narcissa, lovely to see you." His mother moved towards Hermione's mother quickly for a parting hug, and Linda appeared almost taken aback, returning the hug stiffly, before relaxing a bit. "Lovely to see you as well," Narcissa said warmly. Draco leaned towards Hermione and gave her a soft kiss on the cheek, nodding goodbye to Mrs. Granger. "See you next week," he said quietly to Hermione as their eyes met. "Ready, Mum?" Hermione asked, picking up Houdini's cage and her knapsack and placing them atop the trolley with her trunks. "Yes, let's go," Linda answered with a smile. As they headed towards the gate leading back to the Muggle world, Linda nodded to the nice red-haired woman, Mrs. Weasley, who had escorted her into platform 9 3/4 area. The woman smiled and waved, then turned back to the conversation that she was having with a brown-haired man dressed in a rather shabby jumper and trousers. Her companion looked up as the woman waved, catching the eye of Linda Granger, who did a slight double-take. This man looked familiar to her. Who was he? Hermione? Linda turned a quick smile on her daughter. That man over there, the one talking with the red-haired lady, do you know him? That's Professor Lupin. He was our Defense Against the Dark Arts professor in 3rd year. He's sort of a guardian for my friend Harry Potter. Why? Oh, no reason, love. Just curious. But the feeling itched at her, like a rough tag inside of a blouse, digging into her psyche. Who was that man, and why did he look familiar? It wasn't until the following day, on her way out of the Sainsbury's, that she remembered. She'd actually seen the man twice before. The first time had been at a different grocery, several years earlier. She'd walked out of the shop and found Richard talking to that man next to the car. She'd approached them, expecting to be introduced. Each of them periodically ran into patients whilst doing errands, but by the time she got to the car, the man was gone. "One of your patients?" she'd asked. No, he just wanted directions," Richard had replied, and Linda didn't think twice about it. But then, about a year or so later, she decided to surprise Richard with a picnic lunch in the park. The weather was gorgeous, and both of their afternoon schedules had cleared unexpectedly. The practice's receptionist ordered sandwiches and lemonades from the shop round the corner, and Linda hurried to catch Richard at the park, where he sometimes jogged for a bit of exercise. She found him facing away from her, sitting on a park bench, in conversation with the very same man she'd seen at the shop. The two men weren't focused on each other, but rather having a conversation whilst facing forward, something she'd seen men do plenty of times. The other man had a little bag of greens that he was occasionally tossing to the ducks nearby. As she approached, the man caught sight of her and smiled. "I should be going. A pleasure speaking with you." He stood, and before Linda could say anything, walked away. "Who was that?" she'd asked. "Oh, just a nice man making conversation," Richard answered. "We were talking about the ducks. Did you know ducks have 3 eyelids? Turns out they can also see in colour." "Interesting," Linda said as she sat down. She looked around for the man, but he had disappeared almost instantly into the crowd. He seemed familiar. "The duck?" Richard had asked jokingly. "You got to watch out for these ducks, Lindy Hop. They're all guilty of foul play." She laughed. "No, silly goose. That man, the one you were talking to." Richard frowned. "Did he?" "Yes, it seems like last year. You were talking to him in the Tesco parking lot one day. He was lost and you gave him directions." "Huh, how about that? You know me. Remembering names and faces isn't my strong suit. I can never keep them straight. But you know, I hear a pelican." "Richard!" Linda laughed. "Quit quacking jokes and let's eat." They finished their sandwiches, sharing a bit of their lettuce with the closest ducks, and Linda purposefully put the familiar-looking man out of her thoughts, even though something about the interactions seemed odd. She had forgotten what it was, exactly, until today. The second time that Richard and the man met, when the man caught sight of her from several feet away, he seemed to instinctively know that she was coming to interrupt them. He knew that Linda and Richard were together. How? And now she found out he was a wizard all along. Had it all been a coincidence? Or had this wizard made contact with Richard years ago, knowing that Hermione was a witch the whole time? It chilled her, thinking her family might have been being watched for years before the wizarding world had made contact. Had they been under surveillance? Was there a secret network of wizards and witches watching Muggleborns before speaking with them? She thought back to another encounter with a member of the wizarding community that they had met. In this case, it had been one that she and Richard had set up. After their initial meeting with Professor McGonagall in their home, they had been rather curious, and a little spooked, if truth would be told, by the whole idea of magic. They'd always felt that Hermione was special. If Linda killed a houseplant, Hermione took it to her room, and it bloomed again overnight. When Richard lost his watch at the beach once, when Hermione was 5, she told him that she'd get it back for him, and the next morning it was on the kitchen table, the crystal broken and full of sand, but returned all the same. When she was upset once, every window pane in her bedroom window cracked at the same time. And when Hermione was about 10, a young mum, well across the park, forgot to set the brake on her pram, and was unable to catch it as it barreled at a high rate of speed towards a busy street. Linda tried to shield Hermione from the sight, but her daughter fought to look around her shoulder. She held out a hand and said, "Stop!" in a firm voice. The pram rolled to a gentle stop, apropos of nothing, and then turned around and rolled back towards the racing mother. It wasn't normal, to be certain. But was this whole wizarding world all just some elaborate hoax? It did not seem like it, but it was always good to verify such things. Richard had called one of his old trusted military buddies, he'd said. That person put feelers out up his chain of command and got them in touch with someone in British military intelligence. A young woman who called herself Wix had stopped by, reassuring them that yes, in fact there was a wizarding community in Britain, and yes, if they'd been visited by a member of the staff of Hogwarts, the daughter was a member of that community. The woman had been comforting, but had not shared many details with them. All would be explained, she said, at Hogwarts. The trouble was, Linda thought, she and Richard didn't go to Hogwarts. And whilst the time they spent with Professor McGonagall was highly interesting and enlightening, it had only scratched the surface of the questions they had. Well, this strange man had been following them for years, apparently, and her husband was meeting a wizarding couple in secret without her. It was time for answers, damn it. Even in her early 70s, Octavia Cavendish cut a formidable and imposing figure. Though she and Heathcliff were financially well off, she refused to fully retire. Instead, she maintained her seat on the board of trustees at the National Portrait Gallery, where she acted as a docent every other Wednesday afternoon. Her work as the Under-Secretary to the Department of Culture, Media and Sports for the British government was still the stuff of legend. It was because of her that much of the arts enjoyed by locals and tourists alike had been brought to London in the first place. For these reasons, she was highly respected in her circles within the government of England, such as they were. It was these contacts that Linda was counting on. Her mother might be a bit overbearing at times, but Linda always knew it came from a place of love, at least. "Mother, I was hoping that you could put out some discreet inquiries with some of your old contacts in the DCMS. I know it's not generally their purview, but I'd like to get in touch with a woman from military intelligence that I spoke with a few years ago about something." "Military intelligence? Why can't you go to Richard for this? Doesn't he have some military contacts years ago from when he played soldier?" Octavia asked. Linda sighed, gritting her teeth. "Richard was a medic, mum, and yes, he still knows plenty of people in the service, but, well, it's something I want to try to get on my own. Nothing too terribly important, so I don't want to burn one of his favours to get in touch with her." Linda fibbed smoothly. "I see. Is there some kind of trouble between you and Richard?" Why does she even go to her twice-weekly jazzercise class? Linda thought to herself. With all the jumping to conclusions she does, surely she gets enough aerobic exercise. Mother, if you don't think your contacts are able to help, Linda wheedled, knowing that belittling her mother's place of power was the only surefire way to spur the woman into action. No, I'm certain I can find her. What did you say her name was? I didn't, but she goes by Wicks. The following morning, Linda was finishing up a cavity filling when Samantha came over the intercom. Call for you, Dr. Granger. Thanks, Samantha. You can put it through to my office. The thick Scottish accent that met her ears was instantly familiar. This was certainly the young woman that had come to see them. Linda recalled her vividly. She had had bright blue hair with a black streak near the front, about shoulder length. Her striking blue eyes were the same shade as her hair. She was quite recognizable, Linda thought. Hello? Is this Hermione's mum? Yes. Sorry to bother you. I didn't know if you would remember me. Linda began, flustered. I had a few questions, and I didn't know if we could perhaps meet. Do you have any time this week? I can come right now, if you like. Sure, that would be great. There was a small cracking noise, and a swirl of brief wind, and without warning, a young woman stood before her. Linda's shock was immediately outstripped by her confusion. Was this the same girl? She looked similar, at least in the face, but gone was the blue hair and blue eyes, replaced by nearly greyish-brown hair, in a drab ponytail, and grey eyes. She looked almost sad. Are you Wicks? Linda asked, befuddled, the phone slipping dead to the desk service. Yes, Miss Granger. We met a few years ago, the woman said. Yes, of course. You look different. Linda chuckled a bit. My apologies. People don't just usually appear in my office that way. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I know it can be a bit jarring for muggles. The woman smiled kindly. As for my appearance, I'm a metamorph magus, so I can change my appearance at will, see? The girl appeared to be focusing very hard, and suddenly her hair turned green and curly, and stretched down her back. Wow, that's a skill I wouldn't mind having, Linda said, mouth agape. The woman smiled, but her hair went back to the sad mousy brown. You wouldn't be the first person to say it. But I'm not here to talk about myself. What can I help you with? Now that Linda had her here, she was a bit hesitant. What if she had been blowing all this out of proportion? Perhaps the man really had been lost all those years ago. Maybe he just looked like the man on the train platform. And there could have been any number of reasons why Richard had been meeting Narcissa that day. Perhaps Lucius's birthday was coming up and she wanted gift ideas. But it was just too many coincidences. I'm hoping you can shed some light on a few odd incidents that have happened recently. The woman could not, or would not, tell her as much as she'd hoped. Yes, sometimes it is the case that we watch the family of a Muggleborn for a bit before we make contact. There are times that we need to determine the difficulty that the witch or wizard might experience with the transition from a non-magical family to one that knows about magic. So you think that might be what these meetings were? Do you think that the man was trying to gauge whether Richard would be receptive to the idea of magic? Perhaps, the woman said carefully. Linda nodded. And the Malfoys, are they part of this? Were they, shall we say, assigned to us to make our transition easier? Wicks looked at her in confusion. I don't know anything about that. But earlier, you said that you and Narcissa Malfoy had become friends. Oh, yes. She's quite nice. She seems... Well, I don't mean to make presumptions, but she was very interested in Muggle ways. Lots of questions, you know. Is she really? Wicks seemed highly intrigued by this. Does she know many other Muggles or Muggle-borns? Does she talk about them at all? No, not really. Although occasionally she has alluded to a time in her past, perhaps, that she had been in Muggle shops. I took her to a couple of shops. I remember her being surprised by some of the fashions that are currently out there. For instance, she mentioned that she thought she'd find trousers that flare out at the cuffs, or else vest with fringe, headbands, white boots, brightly coloured dresses and shirts. Things that might have been popular in the late 1960s and 70s. That is interesting, Wicks said. Tell me, Linda, do you have an owl or a mobile phone? Yes, I have a mobile. I'm going to give you my number. If you don't mind, can you keep me apprised of anything unusual that happens, particularly with Narcissa? Linda frowned. Is Narcissa in some kind of trouble? No, not at all. It's just, well, if I'm being honest, Narcissa is my aunt. Funny enough, I've never met her. She and my mother had a falling out years ago, but recently I learned, I thought recently that perhaps she might be interested in a reconciliation. Just let me know if anything unusual happens, all right? Linda's brow furrowed. I'm not sure I like keeping secrets from her. I don't want Narcissa to think I'm spying on her. You're welcome to let her know. In fact, if she's interested in speaking with me, perhaps we can all meet. Linda nodded slowly. All right, I'll speak with her and let her know that Wicks is interested in meeting. That sounds great. 2 things, though. Don't mention me around anyone else. Hermione and Draco are probably okay, but no one else, and my real name is Nymphadora, but I usually go by Dora. Oh, Nymphadora, what a beautiful name, Linda said. I'm glad you think so, said Nymphadora with a little smile. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great78.